Hello, we'd like to welcome you to an online talk on the occasion of two projects, both of which are placing women in design at center stage. The first project is a book titled Woman Made, which was published in September by Phaidon. And the second is the exhibition Here We Are, Women in Design, 1900 to Today, which opened at the Vitra Design Museum also in September this year, and will travel internationally from March 2022. Today, we'd like to share some insights into the making of both of those projects and also speak to two very exciting protagonists featured in the book and in the exhibition. So with me here today is the author of the book Woman Made, Jane Hall, joining us from London, and designer Corsa Alsaffar from Kuwait, and Gunjan Gupta, who's in Delhi in India. Hello, you all. So what I might do is just to turn to each of you to speak about your work separately, and then we might all speak together. I'll begin with Jane. Jane, I'll introduce you, and as it's always with introductions like that, there's probably information that's wrong or that's missing, and so we can start the conversation with those things that are perhaps incorrect or have been omitted. So Jane Hall is perhaps most well known as one of the founding members of the London-based Turner Prize-winning architectural practice Assemble, but also she has pursued research around women in architecture and design practice for quite a number of years. In 2013, she started a project, a PhD, on the architect and designer Lina Bobadi, and she's also the author of Breaking Ground, Architecture by Women, which was published by Phaidon in 2019. And her recently launched book, Women Made, is somewhat of a sequel. It features over 200 women designers from all corners of the globe, and she gathered all these women and all that work through a very impressive research process that I'd like to speak about today. Jane, that was quite brief. What's missing or incorrect?
I don't know, I think that's pretty comprehensive, actually. It's a good distillation of, my current research interests, definitely.
But was I correct in saying that your PhD around Lina Bobadi sort of sparked off this interest?
In a way, my PhD was about Lina Bobadi, who is a very well-known Brazilian modernist architect, and I actually looked at her work in, it was a comparison with the work of Alison and Peter Smithson, who were kind of contemporaries working in the British context. So it was really about modernism in the post-war period, and in a way, gender was the kind of elephant in the room. It wasn't the focus of my research, but I was obviously looking at two very well-established and successful women architects in an era when women weren't necessarily so easily kind of getting the same types of commissions. So the work for Breaking Ground, looking specifically at architects, really kind of grew out of following those stories right up into the present day.
Breaking Ground was that 2019 book with Phaidon, which looked specifically at architects, right? So it was your way at looking at that elephant in the room?
Yeah, a little bit, and trying to understand in a way, this kind of absence we have in the historiography of architecture. It's kind of extraordinary how many women architects are practicing today. You would kind of maybe perhaps think that there isn't a problem or hasn't been a problem, and actually the lived experiences and the biographies of these women, I think, unearth maybe a more nuanced way of thinking about gender beyond simply, do you identify as a man or a woman?
It was actually one of the questions I had noted down, because I felt that when we first did our project, which features around 80 women in design. It's quite heavily based on our own collection, but was pursuing a research interest that we had developed over a number of years with the same question, like that elephant in the room was kind of there for us for a number of exhibition and publishing projects too, until we turned to it with this current exhibition, but nevertheless, one of the first questions that we asked ourselves too was like, is it still necessary to make an exhibition or a project around women in design? We were a little bit unsure about it because it also kind of segregates in a way that might feel unnecessary today. But looking back, I do feel like it was still quite necessary because it wasn't always so. And it's still important to kind of discover people that have been overlooked or work that hasn't been given the credit it should have been deserving, as well as also saying perhaps there are women practitioners who were not kind of practicing as designers or educated as designers, but should nevertheless be part of that history. How do you feel around that?
There were and have been always lots of women working in design fields. It isn't, I would say, true that women have only more recently had that equality or sense of equality. And so what I think projects like this do and why they're important is questioning which women we're seeing and why we're seeing them, and why we might think that historically there weren't as many. And I think it's this changing, shifting notion and evolution of feminism and feminist practices, and how that relates to design. Lina Bo Bardi particularly, and I think many of her generation would not identify as feminists at all. And they found lots of work. They were taken seriously, maybe not quite as easily, but taken seriously as practitioners in their time. But it's the way in which they're historicized, which makes us come to think that they were unique or somehow special. And I think in a way, what I think is important about projects like the exhibition at Vitra and these two books is that they're kind of safeguarding for the future. And they're making sure that women in the future aren't kind of going to drop out of that history. And that's why I wanted to feature as many contemporary designers and people kind of working internationally as well, to try and actually just broaden who we're seeing and who is more visible in these discussions.
Perhaps it's time to bring Gunjan and Corsa into it. So, and turn from kind of looking more at the past to looking more at the present. I would like to introduce both of you in the same way that I've introduced Jane. And again, I might leave something out that's quite important, and you are welcome to kind of correct me and then start the conversation that way. So perhaps starting with you, Corsa, you were born in Kuwait and grew up around the Persian Gulf before completing design degrees both at Rhode Island School of Design and at the Royal College in London. But today your studio is based in Kuwait again, right?
Yeah, I found that there was a lot of potential in countries like Kuwait because of how people don't disregard context in some instances. So in my case, I found that there was, in the UK, there was a lot of saturation in design, but the craft industry was shrinking. Whereas in Kuwait, there wasn't a lot of design focus. And there was a booming craft industry, although it wasn't really oriented towards design or household products. So I found opportunity in that.
What's this booming craft industry you're describing about? I'm just curious.
So Kuwait was a trade route from the 1950s. I don't know if actually booming is the correct word. It was a craft industry in the 1950s, and then those crafts migrated to a multinational society of craftsmen. So there's a very labor-intensive craft world in Kuwait, an industrial shweikh. But it's oriented towards construction and the oil industry. So there isn't enough designers to really extract its potential out of it. And that was one of the reasons I came back. And through the years, I've seen a lot more being done with what's available. And it's in a sense, it's very similar to, I'd say, India or Morocco or Turkey, where there's a lot of labor and they're creating the designs themselves. They're the designers and the makers based on what market demand is.
Okay, that might be a good moment to introduce Gunjan as well, who's joining us from Delhi. We've invited her here because her work is in our exhibition at the Vitra Design Museum. Well, Corsa's is in Jane's book, Woman Made. And Gunjan, you studied interior design in Mumbai and also later went to London to Central St. Martin's to complete a degree there, but also returned to Mumbai. Was it for similar reasons that Kawther did?
Yes, so I think the reasons definitely mentioned by Kawther are very similar to my own situation. I trained as an interior designer. I worked in Mumbai, and then I got married and moved to Delhi, which actually really shifted my perspective about the possibilities that India had to offer. Mumbai being extremely urban, I was exposed to a very different potential of the city, homes that were smaller, tighter, and of course we were looking very much to the West for inspiration and ideas and importing a lot from Italy at that time. And when I moved to Delhi, I was surrounded by ateliers all around Delhi, which were, historic bases of craftsmanship and living traditions of, and producing for some of the best brands and houses all over the world. So there was this whole export-import, this paradox of, India importing design, mostly from Italy, all of the brands that we know of, and exporting at the same time, its exquisite craftsmanship that was highly coveted. Of course, the nature of craft was very nostalgic, and I wouldn't say it was of the quality that existed historically, but there was a demand. And as Kawther rightly said, it was not, design wasn't being connected to that story. So, but there was a need for design, and the world was looking at this incredible craftsmanship, but the missing piece was definitely design. So I took a project to Central St. Martin's. There is a master's by project. So you could take a proposal to the college, and I mentioned exactly what I've just said to you, to say that how do I connect this idea of design and luxury craftsmanship for a global audience. And that's really what was missing. The idea was to always work in India because that's where I'm based. And I felt the potential of working with Indian craftsmanship was really required. It was missing. As Kawther said, the true potential had never been really extracted. Having said that, Indian textiles and Indian sculpture and export out of India is very well known. It's extremely prestigious. There's a lot happening in that space. But furniture, there was really nothing. It's a missing piece. And coming from a space of interior design and being in that constant lookout for exotic things, interesting ways of expression, I felt that there was a huge gap.
And can I just ask both of you, there seem to be quite a few parallels in your work, and that you're working with kind of a local craft and kind of accessing that to produce design. Kawther, can I ask you what you're working on at the moment and what your practice actually looks like in a kind of day-to-day way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work primarily with a foundry called Al-Wafi, and they've changed a lot since the pandemic, unfortunately, because the head craftsman there passed away. But what we work on is sand casting primarily. So we make decorative products that have a story and intention to expand their craft and reach a larger audience. So by asking them to invest in better materials like brass and copper, they're reaching a larger audience. And we're using a technique called dual casting, which is actually similar to bidri, which is done in India, where we're mixing two metals. So it's really an investment in materiality. The primary product that we sell is called jewel bowls, which is a mixed metal bowl. It's very decorative, and it's basically capturing the metals as they mix, and it's made out of different materials: copper, brass, zinc, and aluminium. And then some of the other projects we've worked on is something called Desert Cast, where we explore this Orientalist exchange, especially in the exterior context in Kuwait, where gypsum manufacturers in Kuwait are taking Greco-Roman ideas and applying them haphazardly to homes in Kuwait. So it's really defined our context in a very bizarre way. So there's a lot of in-depth exploration into the research of why these things are happening in Kuwait, because they're, as Jane said, oral histories are very important. And in Kuwait, there isn't really much written history.
Right, okay, so you're on top of working as a designer creating products, you're also kind of working on, I suppose, a new narrative in regards to design in your geographical region. Do I understand that correctly? Or
yeah, I'd say it's somewhere between art and design, and I know that's a cliche, but it's for people in Kuwait, it's been hard for them to wrap their heads around because they want to see them as very disparate things. But very often we're creating sculptural objects that are household, and our price points are household because we want them to be accessible. But there's a lot of research and storytelling that goes behind those products. So it's somewhere in between the two. I'm being hired and offered opportunities because I'm Kuwaiti. But in these opportunities, I'm saying that we're trying to persuade people that there's another narrative where you're looking at formative experience and as the experience of craftsmen who are multinational as a more important part of the dynamic than saying I am Kuwaiti, so therefore you should care about Kuwaiti design. And yeah, even in that, when I was working with my colleagues Jasim Nashmi and Ricardus Buzukis, Ricardus is Lithuanian, so he kind of gets put at the bottom of the list, and Jasim, because he's a Kuwaiti male, gets put at the top of that list when people are approaching us. They're interested in the person and selling this idea of the nation state, absolutely.
Gunjan, can I maybe get your views on that as well? I'm sure it's an idea that you're engaging with very much in your practice as well.
I think the cultural imperative was my starting point when I started my practice. And it was something I took very, very seriously. I was very proud of. And it has held its ground for me in my practice. First of all, of course, it was the craftsmanship that I was working and researching extensively, bringing it into my practice, into my work. But it was also this huge, narrative and the stereotype surrounding India that I somehow found myself trapped within. And I found it to be at times a challenge. The paisleys, or whether it was that veneer of decorative arts that is so recognizable all over the world. And when somebody recalls something out of India, there's a certain idea of India that they have. It was definitely a challenge, but it was also a great opportunity to really sort of, look at where 21st century design in India lay. What would it represent? And how would the past, present, and future come together? So, of course, for me, India, I definitely found myself over a period of time becoming this spokesperson for Indian crafts and Indian design in the space of furniture and product. And it's grown in a very interesting way that design is very nascent in India, and craft and design, as I mentioned earlier, don't really come together. And I feel like cultural institutions in India, the government bodies, are sort of taking notice of this relationship, which is really very, very important and interesting. So yes.
We got Corsa before I asked her to describe her work. Perhaps you can describe something. We, of course, purchased some of your work for our collection, but it's also featured in our exhibition and will therefore travel. Could you perhaps describe your approach to your work through those objects as well?
Yes, with pleasure. So furniture design in India is approximately 500 years old. Elevated furniture came to India with European arrival. in the 16th century, approximately. And prior to that, thrones were the only form of elevated furniture that existed. And I've been fascinated by the symbolic aspect of seating, of seats, the status symbol that they represented within our culture, and continue to do so in so many ways. Also, the absence of a vocabulary of furniture design that was Indian. So it was really colonial furniture that was adapted, reproduced, and continues to be so. What I really found interesting, it was either you had the thrones, which were highly decorative and patronized by the royal families or that royal tradition. Then it was the colonial furniture, and post that there was really pretty much nothing. What I found really exciting through my research and my collaborations with various craftsmen was this very exciting existence of furniture design on the streets of India. It was how objects were adapted, recycled to create new forms. And that was, it's something that has been part of the Indian mindset. As we say, recycling is part of Indian culture, symbolism very much is part of our scriptures. So it was the coming together of this idea of thrones and the street side innovation, where bicycles have been recycled to become bullock carts, to become stools, to become tables. They almost never die. It is this endless life cycle that they, are part of. And it was such a beautiful and powerful thought. The other thing was also this, very fast modernizing country, which was almost cannibalizing its own traditions. My studio is in a village, in an urban village in New Delhi. And almost every day I have the privilege of spotting a bicycle vendor who conducts his business on a bicycle with, a halo of products strapped to his back. And it is the most sculptural, spectacular sight. So when I was putting together this, working with the bicycle, the idea of recycle the bicycle parts to create furniture pieces. And the idea of thrones came about in that way, which was subverting the idea of, social hierarchy, street side innovation versus the status symbol of seats. So the idea of storytelling has been consistent in my work, that fusion of the street, the palace or the street, or, that's exactly what, when you visit India, you experience. It's the contrast of different universes that coexist.
May I ask you something, all three of you actually, it's perhaps something that resonates with all of you in different levels or doesn't resonate, and I'd be interesting to hear about that too, is when we were researching for our exhibition, we also spoke with a lot of designers and researchers, and we often encountered this idea that historical research into female designers was also necessary or relevant because of this idea of the role model. For you as practicing designers, and for Jane who did similar research, is this something that kind of plays a role for you as well? Do you feel like there is a lack of women design role models?
God, you go first. I'm still calculating, so.
Sure. I definitely say so, especially in this region. But I also felt like there was a lack of that in the US when I was working there. I applied primarily for craft jobs when I left university, when I left Rhode Island, and they'd continuously tell me that that was not the right place for me because it's unsaid, it's underhanded that it's because I'm a woman and the fabrication is done by men. And then when I started working in the industry, I was always put behind a computer, and that pigeonholed me into a specific direction where I had to use 3D computer skills in order to be able to design and work with male craftsmen. It's just not an environment that's welcoming when all the craftsmen are male. And I think that there needs to be female-only spaces, and that's not just a problem in Kuwait or the Gulf or the Middle East.
All right, that's very interesting. Jane, I think you wanted to make a contribution also.
Well, yeah, no, following that actually, I think it's definitely true, or at least interesting, the way you see the kind of socially constructed thing that is gender. And so, you know, coming from a symbol where everything was predicated on self-build and the joy of making, and that you would be a good or better designer if you had an understanding of how things are made, you know, physically feeling a saw go through some wood. And, you know, we did that, a lot of that when we were young, but I can see as our practice has evolved, it's still the men who have the confidence to just go into the workshop and do something. And a lot of the women who you do see more hesitant about it, who have a sense that you know, they could do it, but you might have to talk to a man to ask a question about how the workshop's made, and or how to do things. And always this sense of maybe doubt in traditionally gendered spaces, even if you know your knowledge is no different from someone else's. And I know that's not true of all women, but I certainly know it's true of, you know, many. Otherwise, you would just see more women craftspeople. But interestingly, I wasn't so sure about the whole role model thing for a while, but recently teaching, I had students for the last session bring to me women architects who they wanted to present to the class. And it was a really diverse group as adults. They all brought a woman from their home country. So we're all in London, but the Swiss man brought a Swiss designer. The woman from Hong Kong brought someone from Hong Kong, you know, and it was just, even the guy from tech, he brought a woman in architecture who pioneered technology. So people are drawn to who resonates with them and practices that they resonate with them. So I think not only is it important that we have great women architects, designers as mentors, as role models, but that they are people that you can have a connection to because there's a diverse spread. You know, I love people like Elizabeth Diller or, you know, great architects and designers like that, but the kind of corporate American woman, not really my vibe. I need to see people who maybe are doing something different, like the Matrix Design Cooperative, who are demonstrating that you can be a bricklayer and have this history that's amazing. So I think, you know, it's not simply about having more women mentors or role models, it's also coming back to this question of who they are and where we see them.
For sure, I felt the same way, and like you, I also was a bit unsure about the idea of the role model, but now I understand that it's just, you know, we are sort of doing the work and the research now into sort of covering in history narratives and persons who should also be included, and eventually that wouldn't just be women, but just a more diverse kind of, I suppose, dimension of persons and potential role models. But how do you feel about it, Gunjan?
So in India, I think we've been very fortunate with women role models because we have this huge textile tradition. So, you know, in the context of craft, there are the weaving societies, which are primarily female driven, and there are several role models within that. You know, Save the Sari. The Sari has been, there's been a lot of effort by a lot of women entrepreneurs over the last 70 years, I would say, in sustaining the tradition and so on and so forth. So I would say, if I had to think of role models within craft space, I have been inspired by many and the great work that they've done within the space. But if I had to think of role models in the space of design, or, you know, when I was really looking for something, I obviously felt that there was a huge gap. But also when I found myself working with craftsmen and perhaps hoping to be a role model, that's not how I started out, but, you know, when I found myself to say that, you know, this is introducing them to the idea of design or working with them with new ideas, I felt there's a huge resistance culturally and in the gender context of taking instructions from women in India. So they would just not be open to new ideas or having a dialogue or an engagement, and that still continues. And I think we're really a long ways away for that to change, for a woman to be leading that conversation in India. So I would say when it comes to role models, it's really male to male, it's female to female. That's how the whole craft system in India is constructed. It's a reality. It's an interesting time, though. I think it's shifting. There are new voices, and amazing things are happening. So, you know, when the physicality of design comes into place and craft and design meet, and it's a collaboration between myself and this incredible craftsman, and we put on an equal platform, I think, you know, it changes the game quite a bit.
Perhaps in that respect, I might also address all three of you as designers, because Jane, unlike me, you also practice as a designer and not just as an author and curator. And you've all touched on it in various ways before, but I feel like for me, as someone who looks at these at design and design history on a quite theoretical and also historical level, I feel like to me, looking at women in design has really just given me a different lens to view design through. It doesn't mean that I'm just looking at the cause or the representation of one gender in design. It also means that it sort of has given me an idea of how much more diverse design practice and understanding of it could be. So in that way, Corsa, you just said in your practice, female-only spaces are needed. Can I just all three of you ask you again, like what are you looking forward to in the future of practice, or what are you really wishing for, regardless of whether that is something to do with women or gender or not?
I'm not sure. I think the you know, what I really took from doing the research for Women Made, which I think would extend to architects as well, is this sense of the value of craftsmanship and craftsmanship and of making things. And I think that's, you know, essentially just in direct tension with the kind of commercial conditions that give birth to many projects. You know, if it's not commercially viable, it's never coming off the ground. And that, you know, that there are ways to invite failure and mistake and experimentation into practice again, which I think you do see in the early post-war period, and even before that, when you know, lots of women like Belle Kogan and Helen Hughes Delaney were looking at using metals in really experimental ways. And so actually, I think for me, it's about like design, just like letting go a bit, just like loosening up and embracing, you know, all these amazing voices and elevating them so that they are on an equal footing, so that when you do go onto Cartel's website or any one of those other big manufacturers, you see more women there, and you see design that actually has a rich history and a texture, and doesn't necessarily, which is the critique of the kind of corporate design world, I would say, that it could be anywhere. And so I think some of those things are the things I would like to see in the future, and definitely kind of pursue within my own practice as a designer, but also as a researcher, making projects like Women Made.
Fantastic, great answer. Can I pass the talking stick to you, Gunjan, maybe?
I have a little bit of a funny story to say. Speaking of those opportunities on these incredible websites, well, I've been working within the international space for a number of years, and in several instances, you know, not always is a portrait picture accompanying a piece of design. So just by default, my work has always been assumed to be the work of a male designer, because my name is not, you know, it could be male or female. So it's just assumed to be a male designer behind this. And I've always gotten an email back to say, Mr. Gunjan Gupta or whatever. And I find it really, really funny at times. And then I do feel that when I've written back to say it's, I'm a woman, I've had to explain that. And I don't know, in retrospect, if that has changed the equation a little bit, but I do feel equal opportunity has, I mean, firstly, I'm Indian, and on top of that, a woman. So definitely, I would like more equal opportunities on both fronts. The other thing with regards to how I would like this to change within the Indian context is just confidence. You know, I think we have such incredible ideas, and girls, more and more girls are getting educated. There's a lot of passion. There's a lot of exposure as well. But the confidence to not let that piece of design which you've doodled and scribbled on to end up in the dustbin is really what I would hope. More funding, more opportunities, more platforms that allow for this to happen. Also, historically, the point of creation in Indian culture and our scriptures has always been the Devi, who was credited with all creation. But unfortunately, that's completely lost within the contemporary context. You know, it's a lack of confidence.
Okay, thank you. Great answer too. Perhaps, Kawther, I might let you have the last word, because I also think we have to come to the end of this conversation. So it would be great to hear from you. I think you're probably also the youngest person on this panel, to sort of hear from you what you're looking forward to changing, or perhaps changing yourself.
Well, I'd really like more emphasis on education in the work of craft. So not just at the educational level, but while we're working, like Jane said, for there to be like an opportunity for more experimentation and for failure. I really do think that that's important. I think for me personally, once I left the Royal College of Art, the onus was on me to experiment in the same way without any of the structural support that I had before. And a lot of people in my industry would like to see more maker spaces in Kuwait. I know in the West, there's a much larger emphasis on that. And I think just expanding that would be great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was so interesting to hear from all of you. I feel like having a lot more panels like this from all corners of the globe in the future. So thank you very much. And I hope our paths cross very soon again, online or in the real world. So thank you.
Definitely. Thanks, Viviane.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.